The courtroom was quieter than usual that Tuesday morning. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Providence Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. At the defendant's table sat Maria Santos, a 42-year-old mother of three, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a manila folder filled with medical bills and court documents. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his papers, his kind eyes immediately noticing the woman's obvious distress. Something about her posture, the way she held herself with dignity despite her fear, told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary parking violation case. What happens when a cancer survivor, drowning in medical debt and struggling to rebuild her life, faces a judge who sees beyond the letter of the law to the human heart beating beneath? What happens when justice meets compassion in a moment that would change not just one woman's life, but touch millions of hearts around the world? Maria had received multiple parking tickets during her chemotherapy treatments, tickets she couldn't afford to pay while fighting for her life. The fines had accumulated to over $800, a sum that might as well have been $80,000 for someone living paycheck to paycheck. She expected the worst. More penalties, payment plans she couldn't manage, perhaps even a suspended license that would cost her the job she desperately needed. The bailiff called her case number. Maria stood on unsteady legs, still weak from her recent treatments. The courtroom spectators, mostly there for their own cases, barely glanced up. They'd seen it all before. Another person unable to pay their fines, another routine proceeding in the endless cycle of municipal court. But Judge Caprio was already studying her face, reading the story written in the lines of worry around her eyes, in the careful way she moved, in the hospital bracelet she still wore on her wrist. He'd presided over thousands of cases in his decades on the bench, but something about this moment felt different. "Mrs. Santos," he said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved by millions who watched his courtroom proceedings. "Please tell me what brings you here today." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the court reporter paused, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would be more than just another case number in the daily docket. No one in that room, not Maria, not the spectators, not even the seasoned court staff, expected what Judge Caprio would say next. They were about to witness something that would remind them why he was known not just as a judge, but as a beacon of humanity in a system often devoid of compassion. Maria Santos had never imagined she would find herself standing before a judge. Just 18 months earlier, she had been living what she considered a blessed life, working 2 jobs to support her 3 children, ages 8, 12, and 15, in their small apartment in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood. She cleaned offices at night and worked at a local diner during the day, barely making ends meet, but proud of her independence, and determined to give her children opportunities she'd never had. Then came the diagnosis that changed everything: stage 3 breast cancer. The words hit her like a physical blow when Dr. Richardson delivered the news in his sterile office at Rhode Island Hospital. At 41, Maria thought she was too young for cancer. She thought her occasional fatigue was just the result of working 16-hour days. She thought the small lump she'd noticed was nothing serious. After all, she had no health insurance and couldn't afford to worry about every minor concern. But cancer doesn't care about your age, your circumstances, or your ability to pay for treatment. The next months became a blur of chemotherapy sessions, radiation treatments, and mounting medical bills. Even with assistance programs, the costs were overwhelming. Maria had to quit her night cleaning job. She was too weak to work after her treatments. The diner where she'd worked for 6 years had to let her go when she became too unreliable, missing shifts when the nausea from chemo left her bedridden. During those darkest months when she could barely lift her head from the pillow, getting to her medical appointments became a daily struggle. The hospital was 15 minutes away by car, but the bus route required 2 transfers and took over an hour each way. With her immune system compromised, her oncologist strongly advised against public transportation. So Maria did what any mother fighting for her life would do. She drove to every appointment, often arriving early and staying late in the hospital parking garage, because it was the only place she felt safe resting between treatments. She tried to feed the parking meters. She truly did. But chemotherapy brain fog is real. And there were days when Maria would emerge from a 4-hour treatment session barely able to remember where she'd parked her car, let alone whether she'd put enough quarters in the meter. Some days she didn't have quarters at all. Every dollar was carefully allocated for groceries, rent, or her children's school supplies. The first parking ticket appeared on her windshield after a particularly brutal chemo session. Maria found it fluttering in the November wind, the $35 fine as daunting as her medical bills. She tucked it into her purse, promising herself she'd deal with it when she felt better. But better seemed to never come, and the tickets multiplied. Soon there were 8 tickets, then 12, then 15. Her oldest daughter, Christina, tried to help by walking to the hospital after school to move the car or feed the meters. But a 15-year-old shouldn't have to manage her mother's parking tickets while watching her siblings and trying to maintain her honor roll grades. The weight of responsibility was crushing them all. Most judges in municipal court see dozens of parking violation cases every day. They hear the same excuses. I was only gone for 5 minutes. The meter was broken. I didn't see the sign. After years on the bench, it becomes routine. Read the violation, assess the fine, move to the next case. Justice in these courtrooms is often mechanical, processed with the efficiency of an assembly line. But Judge Frank Caprio had never been like most judges. In his 38 years presiding over Providence Municipal Court, he'd built a reputation for looking beyond the paperwork to see the human being standing before him. He understood that every case represented a person's story, and every story mattered. When Maria's case was called, Judge Caprio didn't immediately look at the stack of parking tickets. Instead, he looked at Maria, really looked at her. He saw the way she moved carefully, as if her bones were made of glass. He noticed the silk scarf wrapped elegantly around her head, covering what he suspected was hair loss from chemotherapy. He observed the tremor in her hands as she opened her folder, the way she had to steady herself against the defendant's table. "Mrs. Santos," he said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Before we discuss these parking violations, I want you to know that this court is here to serve justice, and justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes justice means understanding. So please, sit down if you need to, take your time, and tell me your story." The courtroom, usually filled with the restless energy of people waiting for their cases to be called, fell unusually quiet. Something in Judge Caprio's tone suggested this wouldn't be a typical proceeding. Even the other defendants found themselves leaning forward, drawn into what was clearly going to be more than just another parking ticket case. Maria took a shaky breath, looked into the judge's kind eyes, and began to speak about the hardest year of her life. As Maria began to share her story, her voice barely above a whisper, something remarkable happened in the courtroom. The usual sounds of a busy municipal court, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, the bailiff's radio crackling, seemed to fade away. Even Judge Caprio, who had heard thousands of stories over his decades on the bench, found himself leaning forward, drawn in by the quiet dignity with which Maria spoke about her battle with cancer. "Your Honor," Maria began, her accent carrying the musical cadence of her Dominican heritage, "I know I have no excuse for these tickets. I know everyone has problems, and mine aren't special. But when they told me I had cancer, everything changed. I couldn't work anymore, couldn't think straight most days. All I could focus on was getting to my treatments and getting home to my children." She reached into her manila folder with trembling fingers and pulled out a hospital bracelet, faded from months of wear. "I kept this to remind myself that I'm a survivor now. But surviving, it came with costs I never imagined." Judge Caprio studied the stack of parking tickets before him. 15 violations, all from the same hospital parking area, all during weekday afternoon hours, exactly when chemotherapy appointments would be scheduled. The dates told a story of their own, a concentrated period over 8 months, with gaps that likely corresponded to treatment cycles. But what struck him most wasn't the tickets themselves. It was the woman standing before him, clearly still recovering, who had somehow found the strength to appear in court rather than simply ignore the fines or declare bankruptcy. There was something profoundly moving about her determination to face her obligations, even when those obligations seemed insurmountable. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said, setting the tickets aside and folding his hands, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you here today because you want to pay these fines or because you feel you have to?" The question caught Maria off guard. She'd prepared for anger, for lectures about responsibility, for payment plans that would stretch her already impossible budget even thinner. She hadn't prepared for this gentle inquiry into her motivations. I'm here because it's the right thing to do," she said finally. "My children are watching how I handle this. I can't teach them to run away from their problems, even when those problems feel too big to solve." Judge Caprio nodded slowly. In 38 years on the bench, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between genuine hardship and elaborate excuses. Everything about Maria's demeanor, her obvious nervousness, her careful preparation, the way she spoke about her children rather than making demands for herself, told him this was a woman trying to do right by a system that had, in many ways, failed to account for human frailty. "Tell me about your children," he said, a slight smile warming his features. "What are their names?" This unexpected turn in the conversation brought the first real light to Maria's eyes since she'd entered the courtroom. "Christina is 15. She's been my rock through all of this. She takes care of her younger brothers, Miguel, who's 12, and little David, who's 8. Christina wants to be a nurse someday. She says watching me fight made her want to help other people fight too." "And how are you doing now, health-wise?" Judge Caprio asked. "The doctors say I'm in remission," Maria replied, touching the scarf on her head unconsciously. "I start a new job next week, just part-time at first, but it's a beginning. I'm trying to rebuild our life." The courtroom had grown so quiet that the judge's next words seemed to echo. "Mrs. Santos, I want you to listen to me very carefully. In all my years on this bench, I've learned that the law is meant to serve justice, and justice is meant to serve humanity. Sometimes those two things align perfectly. Sometimes they don't." He paused, looking directly at Maria with the intensity that had made him legendary among those who had appeared before him. "You fought cancer. You fought it while raising 3 children alone. You fought it while worrying about money, about parking meters, about things that should have been the least of your concerns. You fought it, and you won. Do you really think this court is going to punish you for winning that fight?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. Around the courtroom, spectators found themselves leaning forward, many wiping their own eyes. The court reporter, a veteran of thousands of proceedings, had to pause to compose herself. "Your Honor, I don't understand," Maria whispered. Judge Caprio stood up behind his bench, a gesture that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried not the authority of legal judgment, but the warmth of human compassion. "Mrs. Santos, this court hereby dismisses all parking violations against you, all of them. You don't owe this city a single penny." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Maria swayed on her feet, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice rising above the applause, "I want you to know that what you've been through, fighting cancer while raising your children, facing your responsibilities, even when it would have been easier to hide, that takes more courage than most people will ever have to show. You are not a defendant in this courtroom. You are a hero." The applause grew louder. Maria covered her face with her hands and wept. As the applause in the courtroom gradually subsided, something profound had shifted in the atmosphere. What had begun as a routine municipal court session had transformed into something deeper, a moment that reminded everyone present why they had chosen to believe in justice, in compassion, and in the fundamental goodness of humanity. Judge Frank Caprio remained standing behind his bench, watching Maria Santos as she struggled to compose herself, and in that moment, decades of judicial wisdom crystallized into a simple truth. The law at its best serves not as a sword to punish, but as a shield to protect the vulnerable. The video of that day's proceedings would eventually be viewed by millions around the world, but for those who witnessed it firsthand, the impact was immediate and visceral. Other defendants waiting for their cases found themselves crying alongside Maria, moved by the recognition that they too were more than their mistakes, more than their violations, more than the circumstances that had brought them to court. The bailiff, a tough former police officer who had seen every type of case imaginable, later admitted it was the first time in 20 years that a court proceeding had brought him to tears. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Judge Caprio himself. In interviews years later, he would reflect on that day as one of the defining moments of his career, not because of the legal precedent it set, but because of the human precedent it reinforced. "When I looked at Maria that day," he would say, "I saw my own mother, who immigrated to this country with nothing and worked every day to build a better life for her children. I saw my wife, who has fought her own health battles with dignity and grace. I saw every person who has ever faced circumstances beyond their control and chosen to meet them with courage rather than surrender to them with despair." The ripple effects of that single moment extended far beyond the confines of Providence Municipal Court. Maria Santos returned to work the following week with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. Her story, when it was eventually shared on Judge Caprio's television show, Caught in Providence, inspired thousands of viewers to reach out with job offers, donations, and expressions of support. More importantly, it inspired other judges across the country to consider how they might incorporate compassion into their own courtrooms. Christina Santos, Maria's 15-year-old daughter, did indeed become a nurse, graduating at the top of her class from the University of Rhode Island's nursing program. In her valedictorian speech, she credited that day in court with teaching her that healing comes in many forms, sometimes through medicine, sometimes through chemotherapy, and sometimes through the simple act of one human being seeing the dignity in another. The case also exemplified what made Judge Frank Caprio unique in the American judicial system. Throughout his 4 decades on the bench, he had consistently demonstrated that justice and compassion were not opposing forces, but complementary ones. His approach was never about ignoring the law or excusing wrongdoing, but about applying the law with wisdom, context, and an understanding that every person who appeared before him was navigating their own complex circumstances. This philosophy earned Judge Caprio recognition far beyond Providence, Rhode Island. His courtroom became a destination for people seeking not just legal resolution, but human understanding. Lawyers would drive hours to appear before him, knowing that their clients would be treated with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Social workers would recommend his court to families struggling with violations they couldn't afford to pay, trusting that Judge Caprio would find a way to serve both justice and mercy. The success of Caught in Providence brought Judge Caprio's approach to a global audience, with viewers from dozens of countries writing to express their amazement at seeing compassion integrated into legal proceedings. Many wrote that they had lost faith in institutional justice until they witnessed Judge Caprio's courtroom, where the law was administered with both firmness and humanity. But Judge Caprio never sought recognition for his compassionate approach. In his view, he was simply doing what judges should do, looking at each case not as an abstract legal matter, but as a human story requiring thoughtful consideration. "The law is not a machine," he would often say. "It's a tool, and like any tool, its value depends entirely on how it's used and who is using it." The Maria Santos case became a teaching example in law schools across the country, not for its legal innovations. The dismissal of the tickets was well within Judge Caprio's discretionary authority, but for its demonstration of how judicial discretion could be exercised with both compassion and wisdom. Law professors would use the case to illustrate how judges could maintain the integrity of the legal system while acknowledging the human complexity of the situations brought before them. Perhaps most significantly, the case highlighted the broader social issues that individual legal cases often represent. Maria's parking violations were symptoms of a healthcare system that imposes devastating financial burdens on families dealing with serious illnesses, and an economic system that provides insufficient support for working families facing medical crises, and a society that often criminalizes poverty rather than addressing its root causes. Judge Caprio understood that he couldn't solve these systemic problems from his municipal court bench, but he could ensure that his courtroom was a place where people facing these challenges were treated with dignity and compassion. He could make certain that, at least in Providence Municipal Court, justice would be tempered with mercy, and the law would serve humanity rather than demanding humanity serve the law. The legacy of that day extends beyond any single case or any single judge. It represents a vision of what justice can be when it's guided by both legal expertise and human wisdom. Years have passed since Maria Santos walked out of Providence Municipal Court with tears of gratitude streaming down her face, but the impact of that moment continues to resonate in ways both large and small across the American justice system and beyond. The case has become more than a single instance of judicial compassion. It represents a philosophy of justice that recognizes the profound humanity in every person who stands before the bench, regardless of their circumstances or the nature of their alleged violations. Judge Frank Caprio's approach to Maria's case exemplified what many legal scholars now refer to as therapeutic jurisprudence. The idea that legal proceedings should, whenever possible, promote healing and rehabilitation rather than simply punishment and deterrence. This concept, while not new to academic circles, found its most powerful practical demonstration in courtrooms like Judge Caprio's, where the theoretical became tangible through daily acts of compassion and wisdom. The transformation in Maria's life following her court appearance illustrates the far-reaching effects that judicial compassion can have. Not only did she successfully rebuild her career, eventually becoming a patient advocate at the same hospital where she had received her cancer treatment, but her story inspired policy changes in municipal parking enforcement. Providence and dozens of other cities across the country now have provisions allowing for the waiver of parking violations accrued during medical emergencies, directly influenced by the attention Maria's case brought to this issue. More broadly, Judge Caprio's legacy challenges us to reconsider our collective relationship with justice and mercy. In an era when the American criminal justice system faces criticism for its harshness and disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations, Judge Caprio demonstrated that it was possible to maintain order and respect for the law while treating every defendant with dignity and compassion. His courtroom became a laboratory for testing whether justice could be both effective and humane, and the overwhelming positive response from his community proved that it could. The global reach of Judge Caprio's television show brought international attention to American municipal courts, but more importantly, it sparked conversations about judicial philosophy in countries around the world. Legal systems from Canada to Australia began examining how they might incorporate similar approaches to minor infractions. In Italy, where Judge Caprio's family originated, his methods were studied as an example of how immigrants to America had enriched their adopted country's institutions while maintaining the humanistic values of their heritage. What made Judge Caprio's approach so compelling was not that he ignored the law, but that he applied it with a deep understanding of its ultimate purpose. The law, in his view, existed to create a just society. And a just society was one that protected the vulnerable, offered second chances to those who made mistakes, and recognized that circumstances often matter more than intent. This philosophy was never about excusing wrongdoing or abandoning accountability, but about ensuring that the punishment fit not just the crime, but the person who committed it, and the circumstances that led to their appearance in court. The hundreds of cases Judge Caprio handled with similar compassion created a ripple effect throughout the legal community. Young lawyers who appeared before him carried his approach into their own practices. Court personnel who worked with him brought his philosophy to other courtrooms. Most importantly, the thousands of defendants who experienced his form of justice left his courtroom with renewed faith in the American legal system and a deeper understanding of their own worth and potential. This impact was particularly significant for immigrant communities and families struggling with poverty. For many, their appearance in municipal court represented their primary interaction with the American justice system. When that interaction was characterized by respect, understanding, and fairness, it reinforced their faith in American institutions and their sense of belonging in their adopted country. When immigrants like Maria Santos were treated with dignity in American courtrooms, it validated their decision to build their lives in America and strengthened the social fabric of their communities. Judge Caprio's retirement in 2023 marked the end of an era in Providence Municipal Court. But his influence continues through the judges, lawyers, and court personnel who learn from his example. Law schools across the country now include courses on compassionate jurisprudence in their curricula. Judicial training programs emphasize the importance of seeing defendants as complete human beings rather than simply case numbers. Most importantly, a new generation of judges is entering the profession with an understanding that legal authority carries with it not just the power to punish, but the responsibility to heal. The ultimate measure of Judge Caprio's legacy may not be found in any single case, no matter how moving, but in the countless small moments of dignity and respect that characterized his approach to every person who appeared before him. Whether dealing with parking violations or more serious offenses, whether facing defendants who were clearly guilty or those whose circumstances were complex and mitigating, Judge Caprio consistently demonstrated that justice and mercy were not competing values but complementary ones. As our society continues to grapple with questions of justice, equality, and the proper role of legal institutions in addressing social problems, Judge Caprio's example offers a roadmap for how individual actors within the system can make profound differences through their daily choices and actions. His legacy reminds us that justice is not an abstract concept, but a lived experience, shaped by the humanity and wisdom of those entrusted with its administration. The tears that filled that Providence courtroom on the day Maria Santos faced her parking violations were not just tears of relief or gratitude, but tears of recognition. Recognition that justice, at its finest, reflects the best of human nature and our collective commitment to treating every person with dignity and compassion. Thank you for reading this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio. If his story touched you, please share it with others so his message of kindness and fairness can continue to inspire the world.